If you really want to know the truth, the whole truth that is, then yeah, I'd have to agree that there were times I should have realised that something was wrong. Times when it should have been blindly obvious that the stories I was being told didn't actually make much sense. But it's all too easy to look back with hindsight and spot the clues that you might have missed along the way, especially when you're right in the thick of it. It's a hell of a lot harder to be objective. And when two of your closest friends get into your car, just seconds after they've brutally murdered 3 people, and even though they're all covered in blood and bits of brain, they start laughing, joking, giggling like a couple of schoolboys who've just seen their first naked woman, well then it's pretty hard to accept that you've unwittingly become part of their crime. On May the 15th, 1996, Darren Nicholls, a little-known petty criminal from Braintree, Essex, disappeared from the face of the earth. The arrest of the stocky 30-year-old electrician 2 days earlier, after 10 kilos of cannabis were found in the back of his transit van, had only barely made the local news. But less than 24 hours later, Nicholls had become the man who everybody wanted to talk to. Detectives from the drug squad were standing by to quiz him about a further 50 kilos of cannabis that had been found sitting at the bottom of a lake. Officers from Scotland Yard's anti-corruption squad wanted to know about his links with a policeman that they were investigating for conspiracy to pervert the course of justice and other criminal offences. While officials from HM Customs and Excise wanted to know about numerous trips abroad that Nicholls had made, during which hundreds of kilos of drugs had been smuggled into the country. But first in line were the Essex Murder Squad. They wanted to talk to Nicholls about the bodies of 3 drug dealers that had been found in a Range Rover in a quiet lane in Rettendon a few months earlier. Patrick Tate, Craig Rolfe and Tony Tucker, all 3 well-known local villains, had each been blasted in the head with a shotgun at point-blank range. Their faces were so distorted that, had their fingerprints not been on file, they would have been almost impossible to identify. Compared to the 3 dead men, Jack Womes and Michael Steele, the men who would later be accused of killing them, Nicholls was a nobody, a bit player in the Essex criminal underworld that includes everything from hitmen and gun runners to car thieves and fraudsters. Nicholls was about as close to the bottom of the ladder as it was possible to be. But soon after the police arrested him, they realised they had a prize beyond measure. Nicholls had worked closely with both the killers and the killed. He knew exactly how their extensive and wide-ranging criminal operations worked and understood the elaborate techniques they employed to avoid capture. He was on first-name terms with all their contacts throughout Britain and Amsterdam. He knew their plans to expand into Europe. He knew who supplied their drugs and their weapons. Most importantly, he knew exactly who had pulled the trigger on that night. If the police could persuade him to talk, to switch sides and turn grass, they knew that Nicholls could be the key to a string of convictions. As it was, they hardly needed any persuasion at all. As he stared at the blank walls of his police cell in the hours following his arrest, Nicholls knew that even if he didn't talk, the men he once considered to be his friends would hunt him down and kill him, just as they had hunted down and killed the others who stood in their way. Today, if you take a trip down to the Public Records Office, you'll find no trace of Darren Nicholls. His birth certificate and marriage licence have both been deleted, his national insurance number has been withdrawn, his passport details destroyed. All his bank and building society accounts have been closed down, along with all his old store cards and hire purchase loans. His driver details have been erased from the computer at Swansea, and he no longer appears on any electoral roll. Even his criminal record is no more. Every possible path that someone might use to try to track him down has been blocked. It is as if he was never born. And it is just as well. In the run-up to the murder trial where Nicholls was the key prosecution witness, according to the police, the most important supergrass since Albert Donahue betrayed the Cray twins in July 1968, the price on his head rose to a spectacular £250,000. All avenues were explored. His mother and brothers were watched and followed to see where they might lead. Friends and neighbours were approached in pubs and clubs and pumped for information or offered bribes. Letters proclaiming that Nicholls had won free holidays and the like were sent to his old address in the hope that they would be forwarded on and he'd reveal himself. All to no avail. At first, Nicholls and his family felt secure in their police safe house, surrounded by panic buttons, alarms and video cameras. But the longer they spent on the witness protection program, the more he felt that the police promises to look after him once the trial was over were little more than a sweetener to ensure that Darren gave evidence at trial. Nicholls never expected a life of luxury in some fancy foreign villa, but the reality, a handshake and directions to the nearest dole office, fell short of even his worst expectations. Nicholls desperately needed to talk it all through, but there was no one around. His wife was too angry with him, the police were too busy. It was only when he heard that one of the senior officers on the murder case was so fascinated by what had gone on that night that he planned to write a book about it that Nicholls himself found a solution. After all, he was the one who had been there. He was the one who had seen the blood-stained hands and smelt the smoking barrels. He was the one who had suffered the nightmares and would have to live a life of guilt and fear. If anyone was going to write a book, surely it should be him. The anonymous phone call to my office, promising to tell me the inside story of the Essex triple murders, came out of the blue. Nicholls had persuaded his police bodyguards to take him to a bookshop, and he had made straight for the true crime section, where he spotted a copy of my first book, Gangland Britain. During that first call, he refused to tell me who he was, or anything about what he might be able to tell me about the killings, only that he was certain I'd be interested. Intrigued, and with hindsight feeling a little reckless, I happily followed his complex instructions, which seemed to come straight out of a Hollywood movie. Drive to this service station, drive around this roundabout 3 times, park down this side street, pick up the ringing public telephone, and so on. I later found out that Nicholls and his minders had tailed my car for several miles to ensure I was alone. Nearly 4 hours after my journey began, I found myself searching for a space in the car park of the Romford branch of McDonald's. As my car drew to a halt, a cautious-looking Nicholls tapped on my window. I've always been fascinated by supergrasses and police informers. The life of a professional criminal is fascinating enough on its own, but the life of someone who betrays their friends and gives up everything to save themselves is all the more fascinating still. Just how do you live under a new identity? How easy is it, overnight, suddenly to become someone else? How can you live with yourself knowing that you are free only because your evidence sent others to jail? That meeting in the McDonald's car park was to be the first of many with Darren Nicholls, during which he slowly, carefully and occasionally emotionally began to recount the story of his involvement in the Essex crime scene in one of the most notorious murder cases of recent times, and in Britain's little-known witness protection programme,